Hi everyone and welcome to Dance Podcast Season 3. I'm your host, Jasmine Cook. This is a dance science podcast presenting discussions with global industry leaders, aiming to make research and information more accessible and enhance dancer wellbeing, health and training at all levels of the sector. New episodes every Monday, 6 a.m. London time. Thank you so much to The Place for sponsoring today's episode. Located in the heart of London, The Place is a creative powerhouse for dance development that is leading the way in dance training, creation and performance. One of Europe's most exciting, innovative dance spaces, where artists from all over the world come to push creative boundaries, to experiment, and to perform outstanding new work. The Place is home to London Contemporary Dance School, a 288-seat theatre, an extensive range of classes, courses, and participatory opportunities for adults and young people, and professional development programs for artists. Check them out at @theplacelondon on Instagram, and they'll also be linked in the show notes. Morning everyone, I'm here today with Archie, who began dancing at the age of 15 years and 3 years later joined the Central School of Ballet, completing his BA Hons in professional dance and performance. He went on to study further at Northern Ballet and joined the company in 2018. After 2 years at Northern Ballet, he left the company to pursue his interest in physiotherapy and has now finished his Masters in Physio at King's in London. In December, he'll be starting his junior rotations. Whilst he will be working across respiratory and neurology, Archie has already developed an interest in musculoskeletal conditions and hopes to specialise in this area in some capacity. I'll let him introduce himself properly. Hi, Archie, welcome.
Hello, hi. Thank you for having me. It's the classic line starting a podcast. Thank you so much. No, it's a pleasure. That's basically me. I can take you through the more detailed story if you would like me to.
Yeah, please do. Just tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are now, how you got into dance, and then how you got into physio as well.
Yeah, so I guess starting off with ballet. So I started quite late. I was in high school. Originally, I wanted to do something involved with languages, but basically towards I think it was Fridays. At the end of the day, you could have this choice of doing something CCF and army related, which wasn't my cup of tea, or an activity. And basically, long story short, all the cool kids went to go do dance. And I thought, I want to be one of the cool kids, so I'm going to do what they do. And so I went to do dance, which was run by my English teacher, Miss Carter, who I adore. And so she had created this dance club, and I think I was 16 at the time. Just went along. It was just, something to do, try and make me a bit cooler. I wasn't a very cool kid. And it kind of, I guess a bit of a cliche story in that we went on a trip to go see Billy Elliot. And afterwards I kind of thought, okay, well, this is something, I haven't thought of or pursued, but it looks fun. And so I said to my parents, and my dad had a friend whose son went to this local ballet school. I went to have a look, and it kind of stemmed from there and quite quickly progressed. So I'm one of those people, I'm very 0 or 100. And so after 6 months, I joined there's Dance East Academy, which is part of the CAT scheme, which is kind of a national thing. And 2 years later, 2 years and a bit, I auditioned for ballet schools because I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I auditioned and got into Central School of Ballet, and that's where I spent 3 years. And my interest was kind of very classical. I wasn't as fussed by jazz or contemporary, although we can get into the importance of being a well-rounded individual. Then I went on. I felt like I needed a bit more, just because, again, I started quite late. So I went and did the grad scheme at Northern, and that's for a year. And within that, we kind of worked with the company, and we were involved in their shows as well as doing extra training. And then David and Yoko offered me a job whilst I was doing that. And then that's when I started dancing professionally, which was, I was very happy to have achieved, and still am happy to have achieved. And so then I danced there for a few years. But it eventually got to a point where the passion sort of dwindled, and I just felt like, we don't do ballet for the money, we do it because we love it. But the love just wasn't really there. So I was always really interested in the physios I worked with, both in ballet school and in a ballet company. So I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? And so I was looking online, asking lots of people, went with Dad to one of his physio appointments because he's always injuring himself. And the physio there said, why don't you do the masters? Because I'd already done a degree before and I couldn't afford to self-fund. And I said, well, I can't do a master's if I've done a BA and like putting on tights and jumping around. But he said, basically explained, there's this something called the pre-reg masters, and this may be of interest to anyone who's looking to pursue it, is because there's a need for physios and many other kind of healthcare workers. They've created this masters. It's basically the bachelor's, the 3 years bachelor's condensed into 2 years with a few master's modules in it, mainly the second year. And it's funded as an undergraduate. So I thought, great, okay, now's my chance. So I applied to universities and got in. And then 2 years later, here I am.
Amazing, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about, firstly, that master's program sounds so great. I didn't really know anything about it, but that's such a clever way of doing it. I think that makes it really accessible for a lot of people. But that's not what we're focusing on. Just to focus a little bit more on your journey. So knowing what you sort of know now through doing your second degree or your master's degree, and also your knowledge and experience that you've had since, what do you kind of wish you knew as a dancer? So did you have any injuries as a dancer that you think I would now treat that differently? What would you have done differently in your training and in your career, knowing what you know now?
Oh, that's such a good question. There's so many different facets to that. So I guess going off my own experience, I can remember distinctly in my first year, I was landing in 5th in some kind of assemblée, and I went over on my right ankle. Felt something, didn't really think much of it, but it just seemed to affect me. I wasn't as stable on my ankle. I couldn't really move it as much as I would have, compared to the other side. And so I went to go see the physio there. And I think what we did was a lot more kind of passive interventions, a lot of kind of dry needling, massage, mobilizations, rather than perhaps a more active approach. And my ankle has still kind of affected me since. So I think and I base this off, my own now knowledge, that I think when we think about injuries with ballet dancers that affect their capacity to, so I think in ballet school, and I'm trying to say this in a way that's perhaps not critical because, there's so many approaches, but for me, a passive approach isn't really going to get someone back to the demands that ballet puts on their body. And so I've been kind of struggling with this ankle injury for a while, and I've sort of done, when I then went to Northern Ballet, the physio's approach was more, there was some passive interventions and stuff, but the kind of the basis of it was more about getting your strength back and allowing your body to meet those demands. And I guess looking back at my training, so if we kind of start back, there's so many things I perhaps would have done differently. And I was 18 and really didn't know any better, so I guess I can't be too mad at myself. But ironically, for a male ballet dancer, I really didn't like jumps or turns. I was more into like adage and something slow and controlled and nice lines, or petit allegro. But I think I struggled with grand allegro. I always struggled to really get myself off the floor and sort of hover. And I think, again, armed with what I know now, if I could go back into the future, I'd probably implement something. Both, I'd be a bit more invested in strength training, like quite significant strength training. I had this misconception that if I lift really heavy weights, I'm suddenly gonna walk around like this. which is just not the case. You know, you have to do a significant amount and probably do some steroids before you get that big. And I'd also implement something like plyometrics. We've got fairly robust evidence that if you basically train this kind of, well, if you train jumping, you're probably going to get quite good at jumping. So I think there are things I would have implemented. And it's funny that I notice now when I do open classes just for the fun of it, because I do more of that stuff, I actually find it, although my technique and flexibility probably aren't that great, not compared to what they used to be, I find it a lot easier to get off the floor. Yeah, so I think going back training wise, that's probably what I would implement more of. I think also, as much as we talk about exercise and stretching and stuff, I probably neglected the psychology side of things. And I think that's a really big factor that's been missing. Perhaps people are a bit more aware now, but I think certainly when I was at ballet school, it just wasn't as big of a deal. But if we think about it, we can't really disconnect our brain from our body. And, the body might be willing, but if you are, feeling anxious or upset or underconfident, you're probably not going to be able to perform at your best. I don't know whether you want to kind of go more into that or whether...
Yeah, definitely. I've got some more questions about that later. Can we just jump back for a minute just to look at your physio degree and application and things like that, because I think some people might be kind of interested in it. So yeah, I've definitely got some more questions later on, a bit more of what you kind of wish you knew at ballet school, but and also what you did know, I guess. But just to look a little bit about the transition from dance to physio. So what was the application process like? Because you said a challenge if you've come from tights and jumping around to degree. And also a little bit about like your placements, what you enjoyed on the course, what it was like, sort of, bit of an overview.
Yeah. So application wise, so if I go to my experience, I'd quit my job, moved back home, thinking, what do I do? And this was before I knew about this pre-registered masters. So I thought, if I don't know what to do, I'm going to do something similar and try and use that to supplement my application. So I did a massage course and a personal training course. I thought, okay, a foundation knowledge of some physiology, anatomy, and some treatment options. So then when it came to the actual application, I knew it's what I wanted to do. So I applied just everywhere. 90% came back and said it was a straight up, they wouldn't invite me to an interview. I think probably because when you look at most of the applications, the websites, they specify that they would like someone who has come from a sports science background or just a science background in general. But there were about 3 universities that did invite me to an interview. And so I'd done a few observational days at hospitals and at private clinics just to get an idea about what I'd actually be going into. And that was really interesting. It was more because my only experience was from musculoskeletal side, bones, muscles, that kind of area. But then I saw this whole other world of respiratory and neurology, which I didn't know was a thing at all. So yeah, then I sent out my applications and was invited to interviews. And so King's was a particularly gruesome interview. So there's lots of different panels. We had to kind of sit outside on this stall and wait for this person over the tannoy to say, you have 5 minutes for your you can enter your booth. And there was such a range. So firstly, there was the obvious, why physio, what do you know about it? What do you feel are your traits that lend themselves to physio? And I think for any dancers that are interested in this area, you can't forget that as much as you might not have done science or a science degree beforehand, you are still armed with a wealth of different skills and attributes that lend yourself to so many other professions and so many other ways of life. And we can kind of come into that, Do you want me to talk about that now, or should we come into that later?
Come into that in a little bit, maybe touch on it now, but yeah, I think I've got a question later, so yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's you've got so many skills like teamworking is massive. You're not going to create a good show if none of you can work well together. You've got to be organized, you've got to be adaptable. So many things. So we talked about that. Then there were other ones about interpreting a graph, and I hadn't seen a graph since AS biology. And so I was trying to remember what a y-axis and what an x-axis is. And in the end, she said, right, I need to ask you some questions about it, because a few minutes had gone by. And I kind of fumbled through it. We sort of, I picked at something, just anything. I thought I have to say something. So I assumed I hadn't got it, which maybe worked well for me, because then I was a bit more relaxed, because I thought, oh, well, I'll just carry on anyway. And so there were others about, I was given a picture of someone who was at a market buying fruit, and I had to explain to the woman as though she hadn't seen the picture. So it was all about communication. Anyway, this went on, and then we had to watch a video on someone with dementia, and I had to talk about that. Yeah, I had a headache afterwards. It was very intense. Then I was working, because I was working in a gym at the time, and I got an email, and it said, you have a message in relation to your recent interview. And I was sort of reading it. As I read it in a tone that was preparing myself for, thanks for coming, but no. And so I read it, "Dear Archie, congratulations." Oh. So then I accepted it and went off to King's to study physio. And then, sorry, what was the next part to your question? I forgot. So there was the application process.
Yeah, and then just sort of the best bits of your course. What placements did you have? What did you enjoy?
Oh yeah. Oh, I loved university. I remember being in ballet school, always thinking, oh, I wonder what university is like. It always is. I wonder if it's like on the movies or in the movies. What did I like? Oh, it was just such a unique experience, as in, for coming from starting your morning with warm up and ballet class, then all the way to starting your day with, I don't know, physiology of breathing. It's it's just it was a whole new world, and I really enjoyed that. I think what I enjoyed, looking back, I loved theory, and I enjoyed kind of all this new stuff, but what I liked most of all was kind of seeing all these scientific minds. And I'm sure that's what people notice when they listen to your podcast, when you have all these very smart researchers on, is that the way of thinking from ballet school and a ballet company to university and science it just felt like such a, well, first it was like a bit of a slap in the face, but it was just so different. And I guess we can come more onto that, is that when we look at ballet and this kind of hierarchical nature and this kind of top-down approach, compared to science, where they will kind of talk about, it doesn't matter how many letters are in your name, if what you're trying to sell me isn't valid and supported, it doesn't matter if I'm a student or if I'm Professor X, Y, and Z. Really, we're all on an equal footing, because if you can't substantiate what you're saying or trying to do, it's not going to fly. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Let's look at that a little bit now. So you kind of mentioned a little bit about mindset, and I guess it's your own personal development. So your own personal development in critical thinking, I guess it comes from research and evaluating information, but it's kind of applicable, like you've just said, to lots of areas. And like you said, it's not encouraged in the arts. So even though maybe a bit of a bold statement, but there's quite a lot of misinformation in the arts, or things that have come from tradition that may not necessarily be true, but we're kind of taught to just accept that these things are true in the way that we train and the things that we do. We're taught to not ask why, I suppose, in ballet. So what do you wish was different in ballet? You've kind of just said, but what benefits could come from applying the way that we kind of think in science to the way that we think in art and in ballet training?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I guess the question is, where would we even start, and where does it kind of stem from? But I guess ballet by nature is founded in tradition. And like you say, questioning things is perhaps not as encouraged. It's probably seen as a bit offensive or an affront to sort of respect, which I can perhaps understand, but I think it's perhaps detrimental to students because we're all so different. So how would we kind of affect that? I guess it comes from the people that are leading at the minute. And I think as our generation that is perhaps a bit more open to challenge, or at least I hope they are, take on roles that are more, they become the directors and they become the teachers. What I hope is that there's going to be more of an openness to individuality and this kind of heterogeneous group that come in, because what I always found difficult with ballet, and this is one example, is the idea of a flat fifth. It makes me think of like all these poor Russian kids being like forced into it. But when we look at, people's hips, that we're all so different that, how do we apply the same rule to each individual, and how do we expect them to perform the same? So I think looking at dancers as individuals rather than as trying to force them through a cookie cutter shape would be quite a benefit, both in training and in performance. And we kind of brushed on it again, but not just looking at the anatomy and the biomechanics and the physiology, but also the psychology, which is such a huge factor. And we all thrive in different ways. And it's how do we kind of incorporate that, and how do we encourage people to perform at their best? It's such a difficult one. Like you said, there is a fair amount of misinformation out there. When I think through to ballet school, ballet company, there were lots of ideas that were kind of thrown at me, not just from teachers, but also from, other people, whether it was in Pilates or whether it was in contemporary. I think, just as a whole, there was a fair amount of misinformation. And I had questions in my head, but like you say, because you're not taught to question it, if you did, you were kind of dismissed, or you just kind of kept quiet because you assumed you were wrong. When I reflect now at some of the questions and thoughts I had, I kind of go on, Archie, you should have said something. You were right. You shouldn't have blamed yourself for that. And I wonder, I don't know whether it would work, because people go to ballet school or dance schools to learn dance. I don't know whether they would be as invested in the scientific process. But what fascinated me and what made me perhaps a bit more critical is the idea of facts, and where do they come from, and how do we get to that point? Because it's actually so difficult to say. Basically, the more I've learned, the more nuanced I've become, and the more I sit on the fence, because I realize it's just not that easy to say X equals Y. You stand in this position and you're going to get injured. You do this in a certain way, and this is going to happen. So that's quite negative to choose injury. There might be positives as well, but I think the more I've understood about the science and the scientific process and research, the more I've realized that things are perhaps not as cut and dry as I might have thought they were back in the day.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. So it kind of advocates for more science integration into ballet training, which we can look at a little bit. I kind of want to finish on that note and see where that goes at the end. But just for now, I don't know whether to go down. I want to look at fueling and the impact of mirrors in the ballet environment. And then I also want to look at kind of strength training and what you did, because you mentioned your turns and your jumps and what you would have done. So which way do you want to go first? Up to you.
Oh, God, let's go for the former and then the latter. Let's start with your first.
Perfect.
Suggestion.
So you mentioned sort of last time we spoke, when we had a little chat about doing the podcast, that I guess ultimately you wish you'd fueled your body. I'm going to say more, I'm not sure. I'll leave that to you to explain. But the impact of mirrors is obviously a big factor for a lot of dancers. But I think it's much less spoken about for male dancers. Fuel's so important, and I think acknowledging what your body needs and how much your body needs is a huge part of ballet training that perhaps we focus on, or are beginning to focus on, more for females, but is maybe left behind a little bit for males at the moment. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So going from my experience, I was I remember I had this real obsession with my thighs. My quads, I felt they were disproportionate to my calves. It was honestly, it was so ingrained in my head. And I can remember being in the top studio in my first year, just looking, and I would try and find an angle or a way of using them that would look better, more aesthetically pleasing, should I say. And it really did become an obsession. And I think, if I'm being totally honest, for some reason I decided, well, perhaps if I eat less or go on some kind of diet, that I will, become leaner. And so then, the size of my quads in some way might, I was already quite small anyway. So I had this idea that actually, have less in me, then my quads are going to look a bit smaller and then more in proportion to the rest of my body. But yeah, just such detrimental effects. And you're right, if you're not fueling, if you think about how much of your time, this is Monday to Saturday, all through the day, you're constantly on your feet, you're doing these really demanding moves and jumps. It's a huge demand on your tissues. And so if you don't have the energy for that, well, your body has to get it somewhere. And we see this a lot in female dancers about some of the changes that happen to their bodies. And what I've kind of learned since quitting ballet, I thought, oh God, what am I going to do? Because I was basically eating the same, but not doing as much of the exercise. And so I joined a gym. I was doing, quite classic things: squats, deadlifts, calf raises, plyometric stuff, just to try and keep on top of it. And I don't know whether, we can look at this from two angles. It was either that just my general relationship with my body became better, and so I was more accepting of those kind of areas, or it actually, by doing that strength training and eating well and everything, my body perhaps fit a more aesthetically pleasing look for what I would have liked when I was dancing, or it's a bit of both, which I usually go for as an answer. But yeah, long story short, I think there is, we can't underestimate that men are still affected by looking in mirrors and being critiqued and wanting to look a certain way. But if they're not perhaps utilizing the resources that they have and not fueling themselves and not working on it, then
I'd ask a little bit more about what you've learned in physio about nutrition that you wish you could apply now to your training. So what's the most important thing that you've learned?
Obviously, I'm quite tentative about talking about areas that I'm, understand my own scope and my limitations, but I'm happy to send you something that you can direct your listeners to, people much more knowledgeable than me. But when we look at it from a really basic perspective of how we generate energy, we eat food, break it down, and it generates ATP, our a energy molecule. And so if we think about the kind of demand that we have, we require a lot of energy in order to complete, just, to stay alive, to start with. But then if we then add on top of that the demands of doing a load of ballet classes, shows, whatever, if we then imagine that as a scale, if we've got this demand, but we're not really eating as much, it's just totally tipped off. Whereas if we can, kind of keep it balanced. Yeah. So if we consider that, dancing requires a lot of energy, and if we're not supplying that, it either has to get it from somewhere else, or we're going to, really suffer from things like fatigue and injury and everything like that. And, that's putting it very basically, but yeah, so really important. And I think it's important to get across to both male and female dancers that by eating, enough, you're not going to balloon, you're probably going to perform better for longer. I don't know if I don't have evidence to back this up, but I imagine, guys, you're probably from that going to be able to jump higher and if you think about, a presser, you're going to lift girls above your head. That's quite a demanding thing to do. And if you don't have the energy to do it, there are eventually going to be some form of consequence.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's great. And I'll link some stuff below, but I think it's just important to acknowledge that sometimes when you step away from ballet and into another career, you can kind of apply the things that you learn and you think, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. So on that as well, our last sort of like main area to look at is something that you mentioned earlier. So you said you hated turns and jumps or pirouettes or anything of that sort of sort. And you should have incorporated, your words, not mine, more plyometrics. So what else do you think would have helped? So looking back now, things you didn't do in your training, perhaps because you just accepted it. And we did in dance, we do a lot of things like Pilates, which, I mean, it comes up in every podcast I speak to, I swear. There's a lot of opinions about it. It does some things, it doesn't do other things. But things like plyo, what else would you have done? And what advice would you give to young male dancers, maybe also struggling with things like turns and jumps? What advice would you give them to improve now?
Yeah, so when we look at kind of some of the exercise principles, and again, I'm talking in an area that I work, but if you want more detail, there are plenty of sports scientists that this is really their thing. But one of the general principles of training is specificity, making your training specific to the demands that you're going to put on yourself, or that you are trying to implement some kind of change towards. So if I'm trying to get better at jumping, there's no point in me doing a load of bicep curls. That's not going to really have much of an effect. So much in the same line, if you're trying to improve your arabesque, if you're trying to practice your turns, implementing training in some way that actually meets that demand, or uses the same muscle groups through a range. Talking about range, if you're trying to improve your flexibility, think about the move that you're trying to improve. So if it is a développé, sitting in box splits, whilst it might improve your range, it's very passive and you're not using the muscles through that range. So what might be better is to take yourself to the range that you can hold it, and working within that, or finding exercises that are quite similar. I hope so. Basically, just making it quite relevant. And that's perhaps where I have a slight issue with Pilates, or at least some of the exercises I just don't feel meet the demands of ballet. I think they can be quite nice, and I think they're useful for people with certain kinds of injuries, particularly if we want them to stay active, but perhaps reduce some of the load that's being put on their body. But yeah, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. Just coming back to what I would do. So for turns, turns are quite interesting because they've got a lot of different components. You're balancing on one leg, you're turning, so you've got all kinds of physics going on that's trying to throw you one way or the other, and then you've got a whole process in your brain that's trying to stop you from getting too dizzy. So there's lots of different factors, and I guess it's difficult to know. This is where kind of having a good coach can help you sort of spot where you might be, where you could work on. So it's very difficult to kind of give a general idea, just because for each person what they need will be really specific. And I guess that's kind of advice to teachers as well, is that sometimes you can have a teacher and you'll go off or do something, and I don't know if you've ever had a teacher that would just kind of say the same correction for everyone. It's like, oh, it's probably because you're doing this, but they perhaps don't look at you as an individual. And then other things I would have wanted to incorporate, kind of things I'm doing now, is a bit more of kind of heavy strength training. I think it's really valuable. And there's lots going on in the physio world about, wanting to really encourage people to be active and strength train. I think it can be really useful. Yeah, so I guess they're the two main things. I think specificity and perhaps something that's a bit more heavy load, particularly for male dancers. If you're thinking about that you are doing really big jumps and really big turns, and there's quite a lot of demand on your muscles and your tendons. Tendons love load. But then, like we said about overhead pressing people, you're not going to get that from doing a bird dog, in Pilates. You're going to do it from practicing that, because your muscles will have to, and joints will have to adapt to that demand. But it's difficult as well. People have got busy days, full of all kinds of stuff. And what we don't want to do, and this is where perhaps a good healthcare team comes into play, is that, because if you have a full day and then afterwards we say, right, go and hit the gym, do a heavy squat or an overhead press. If you're doing that in a fatigued state, you've already done a lot. It's the difficult part of, where do we integrate some of this strength training but still allow you to perform at your best? And I think this is where ballet staff perhaps need to be a bit more understanding that pushing harder doesn't always mean greater benefit. I think sometimes with people actually having a deload, whether that's a day, a week, whatever, allowing them to take some time to focus on either other things or focus on getting better, or just a bit of compromise. I think that could be really beneficial. I do think there is this idea that you need to be constantly pushing. And I sometimes felt that as a ballet dancer. I felt a bit guilty if I wasn't doing something. If at lunch I was just sat, chatting with friends, having something to eat, it was sort of, it was sort of like, oh God, I probably should be doing something. Otherwise I might not deserve to do this role, or I might be kind of judged for it. So I think there needs to be less of a divide between the understandings of the healthcare teams and the understandings of the artistic staff. From my experience, I can only speak from that.
Yeah, no, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. I definitely get that as well. Like we feel like we always need pushing, but it's not necessarily always doing the right things. Something else I want to look at today, you mentioned last time we spoke about your work experience at Royal. Did you was it a day or a week? I can't quite remember. But can you tell us a bit about what you learned from this? Did it motivate you to want to work with dancers in the future, or stay within the general population?
So I remember, so when some of the major ballet companies in the UK were doing it was sort of a tribute to, who was it? To Kenneth Macmillan. And so we were doing a tour. We're doing Concerto, Las Hermanas, and Gloria. Concerto is one of my favorites, beautiful. And as part of Las Hermanas, Zenaida Janowski, who's an amazing dancer, and I think she's retired now, but is still working at the Royal Ballet as a coach. She guested with us, which was very exciting. So I remember, this is when I decided I was leaving. So I was colouring in my little anatomy colouring in book, trying to prepare myself. And she walked in, and I was very excited. I said, oh, I have to say something. And so I just asked how the show is going, and she then asked what I was up to and what I was doing, and I explained that I was moving on to pursue different things, and she was very lovely and gave me the email for Greg Retter, who at the time was the head of healthcare at the Royal Ballet, and he's now gone on, I think, to head Team GB. And so I held on to it. I thought, right, I can't, I have to use this at some point. And when I found out I got into university, I contacted him and said, hi, Greg. I told him my life story. And and he said, come in for the day if you want to shadow, which of course I was not going to turn down. And so went to the Royal Ballet for a day, and I shadowed their healthcare team. So I saw various different people. I met, the Pilates teachers, the physios. I met Adam, who you had on the podcast, which was very interesting to listen to as well. And it's a brilliant facility. And so I got to see the different kind of aspects of how some of the top ballet dancers in the UK and in the world are taken care of. And it was, I guess it was nice to see there was kind of this cohesive unit of different professionals all trying to work towards this goal of, either rehabilitating dancers or helping them to achieve greater performance, which is very nice. Did it make me want to work with ballet dancers? It's something I'd like to try. I think for myself, having a subjective understanding of, what it's like to be a ballet dancer, but also to have injuries and how it affects you, might be quite valuable. I think it also saves you time from having to say, I when I plie, it hurts at the front of my ankle. You can say, you don't have to ask what it is. Or if they say, I've got this pain, but I've got, Raymonda solo coming up, I could get an idea of, how much time they're spending on point, basically what the demands are. And I think that would be quite valuable to dancers. What I wonder is whether you become quite niche in certain injuries, with Adam talking about his epidemiological study, which is very cool to know, and it's really useful to guide, professionals in trying to anticipate what kind of injuries or risk factors there might be. But part of me finds the general population so fascinating. They're so diverse and quirky, and I think, I quite like the idea of just anyone walking through the door and you have no idea what to expect. But who knows? I think it's the very beginning of my career, so I remain open to the options.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely different interesting things about both. You mentioned earlier on that you'd like to see dance educators more aware of sports psychology as an area you're kind of passionate about. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I say this a lot because I'm very aware of my scope of practice, and it's why a team is so valuable, because we have our own specialities, and there are many dance psychologists out there that offer some really valuable information, and again, we can pass on links, and I think Instagram can be quite a valuable tool if you look at the right people. I guess I again have to, I'll try and put this very simply, is that quite often, and this is not just in dancers, but in a population, particularly when they're injured, is that they come in and say, I've got this injury, it's localized to this area, therefore this is the problem. But what we can't forget is that our brain is such a wonderful and complex thing, and it is tied into what's going on in our body, whether you're injured or not. So we can consider it quite simply in that if you've had a day when you turn up to the studio and you've slept poorly, you're stressed, you've got something else on your mind, right? It's safe to say we've had those times. I don't know if that resonates with you, but you can always tell that you usually don't perform at your best. And I guess if I talk from my scope of practice, is that when people are injured, not only does it affect them physically, but so many have a reduced kind of quality of life, and they have certain fears and anxieties surrounding injury. And I think that's really important to get across to artistic staff, is that, the way that you engage with students or, professionals can have such a profound impact, for good or bad. And I think really I'm a fan of, encouragement, and really trying to highlight the positives, because in a ballet class, it quite frequently is, oh, you haven't done this, you're not doing that, do this more. And it's so nice. And I've noticed this when I just do open classes now, it's because we're not aiming towards a show, that you get a lot more praise. Maybe it just means I'm a sucker for validation, but who isn't? I just wish there was a bit more praise and acknowledgement for people that are working so hard. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. I've gone off on a tangent, but just knowing that, you know, people's mood and their thoughts and their feelings has such a big part to play in their physical health as well, is and their performance is vital.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of your different experiences, so from your physio to your ballet, yeah, a lot of your different experiences play in, and kind of, it's interesting, although you say you're not an expert in any of these areas, you have some background in all of them and also some lived experience. And I think it all ties together, and it's interesting to make people aware of how these different areas, so their mood, their nutrition, can all play in. I guess ultimately what, in my opinion, might solve it would be giving dancers more science education in their training to empower them, give them this knowledge themselves, develop their critical mindset, I guess, and a bit of autonomy to question what they're taught, as well as, obviously, I don't want to get into trouble for saying this, but yeah, I guess there's a balance between following what they're told to do and their training and things that we know work, and also having the power to question what they're doing and want to learn more and be their own person. I don't know if that's an interesting note to end on, if you've got kind of a key takeaway or anything else you want to mention or discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I'm such a fan of critical thinking and challenging people. And I think it takes a lot of humility to say, to accept someone's questioning. Like, I can understand the discomfort of someone challenging you, but if you have confidence in your, you know, your viewpoint, or you have something to back it up, then you don't need to worry, because you have a rebuttal, or you have support for your reasoning. But again, I guess this ties into so many factors, such as hierarchy and tradition and, yeah, lots of things. But I think you summarized it far more succinctly than I did.
Not at all. It's been so great to have you on today, Archie. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Chat soon. Bye. Thanks so much for listening. Tune in again next Monday. And in the meantime, follow @SideDance Podcast on Instagram. It would also be so appreciated, if you have a moment, if you could please rate and review on Apple to help the podcast grow. Bye.